Hi, I'm Callie Monroe, and this is the story of how being pushed out of my own family opened a door I never knew I needed. To myself. They told me to disappear, and for a while, I believed them. But sometimes the hardest goodbye becomes the first step toward the life you were meant to build. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. Thanksgiving dinner smelled like home, but felt like exile. The scent of turkey and pumpkin pie wrapped around me the second I stepped through the door, as familiar as an old quilt. But it couldn't smother the cold draft trailing down my spine. The living room was lit by the soft flicker of candles, the Macy's parade buzzing low on the TV. The walls, once covered with photos of every family milestone, now seemed curated. Perfect, sterile, missing pieces no one dared mention. I hadn't crossed that threshold in 3 years. Maybe I should have stayed away longer. Jeanette, my mother, greeted me with a smile so polished it might have cracked if I looked too closely. She kissed my cheek like we were acquaintances, not blood. Brielle, my sister, barely glanced up from her phone, her manicured fingers tapping with a rhythm that felt like an accusation. I tightened my grip on the casserole dish in my hands, willing my smile not to tremble. Dinner was a performance. Conversations tiptoed around real feelings like dancers afraid of stepping off their marks. Brielle, ever the star, held court with tales of her brilliant career moves and exclusive new connections. I tried to chime in about the library's latest community project, a reading program for seniors. But Brielle cut me off with a laugh sharp enough to draw blood. "Still playing librarian with your little passion projects, huh?" she said, swirling her wine. "Some people just peak early." I caught Mom's eyes across the table, searching for even a flicker of defense. She just shifted the cranberry sauce closer to her plate and smoothed her napkin in her lap, pretending she hadn't heard. I swallowed hard, setting down my fork with a deliberate clink. My appetite had left somewhere between the stuffing and the growing lump in my throat. Brielle leaned back, surveying me like a critic sizing up a disappointing painting. "You know," she said, voice syrupy and lethal, "some people just don't know when they're not wanted." A rush of heat burned up my neck. I looked instinctively to Mom, praying, pleading for the voice that used to scold, to soothe. Instead, she adjusted the gold napkin ring on her plate, as if the perfect curve of metal mattered more than my breaking heart. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. I scraped back my chair slowly, the legs dragging a protest against the hardwood floor. I stood, feeling the weight of 1,000 invisible hands pushing me toward the door. My fingers curled around the strap of my purse, steady now, as if my body had made the decision my heart refused to voice. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was survival, maybe it was both. "Maybe I should leave," I said quietly, almost marveling at how calm I sounded. Brielle didn't miss a beat. She leaned forward, her smile a knife's edge. "Maybe you should," she whispered. And then, louder, ringing across the table like a verdict, "Disappear forever." I waited, God, how I waited, for someone to object, for Mom to reach out, to say, "Don't go," or even just to say my name. But there was only silence, and the soft clink of Brielle's wineglass meeting the table. I placed the casserole on the counter, untouched, picked up my coat. No one moved. No one said a word. I walked to the door on legs that felt strangely solid, like I was anchored to something bigger than their indifference. Something called self-respect. As the front door clicked shut behind me, I realized no one tried to stop me. They didn't just close the door that night. They locked it from the inside. I felt it with every step I took down the front walk, the cold seeping up through the soles of my shoes, numbing me. Behind me, the house stood in perfect stillness, all glowing windows and muted laughter, as if my absence had been the plan all along. Once, when I was 8, I stood outside in the rain, waiting for someone to call me home. No one did. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream. I brewed a pot of coffee, curled up on the second-hand couch in my tiny apartment above the florist shop, and forced myself to think about mundane things: the grocery list on the fridge, the half-finished novel on the nightstand. But even with the window open and the smell of damp earth rolling in, the apartment felt suffocatingly small. Work at the library helped at first. Cataloging donations, helping Mrs. Everett print boarding passes for her grandchildren's visit, restocking the local history section, all mechanical motions that didn't require much thinking. But by lunch, my phone buzzed on the desk, rattling against the wood like a wasp in a jar. I hesitated before picking it up. It was Aunt Darlene. "Callie, sweetheart." Her voice oozed sympathy so thick it nearly drowned me. "I heard about what happened. I just wanted you to know some folks are saying things. Not me, of course, but you know how people talk." My stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" A pause. The clatter of dishes in the background. "That you're troubled. That maybe it's for the best, keeping distance. For everyone's sake." I thanked her with mechanical politeness and hung up before she could bury the knife any deeper. I sat staring at the library's polished floorboards until they blurred together. Later that afternoon, I slipped into Rosie's Diner, the kind of place where the coffee was always a little burnt and the waitresses called everyone hon. I thought maybe a piece of pie and some background chatter would help. The door jingled when I entered, drawing a few glances from the regulars hunched over their booths. I settled into a seat by the window, ordered a slice of pecan pie, and tried to disappear into the murmur of conversations and the clink of cutlery. But it didn't take long before I caught snippets floating over from the next booth. "Poor Jeanette," one woman sighed. "Raising a girl like that must have been so hard." "Ungrateful," another tutted. "I always said, there's something not quite right with that one. Always off in her own little world." I gripped my fork so tightly the metal bit into my palm. They didn't say my name, but they didn't have to. The words slithered under my skin all the same. A movement caught my eye. A young man standing at the counter, waiting for a to-go order. Miguel Torres. It took me a moment to place him. Thinner now, his hair longer. A faint scar tracing the edge of his jaw, but unmistakable. Years ago, he'd been the shy boy who practically lived at the library, hiding among the stacks to avoid whatever waited for him at home. Miguel glanced over, caught my eye, and offered a small, uncertain nod. I nodded back, the motion stiff, surprised by the flicker of warmth in my chest. I shoveled another bite of pie into my mouth, more to keep from crying than from any real hunger. Back home that evening, I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, trying to drown out the ache. That's when the first message popped up. An Instagram DM from an account I didn't recognize. No profile picture. "You're not wanted. Never were." I stared at the screen, the words swimming. For a moment, I thought about deleting it, pretending I hadn't seen it, pretending was something I was getting good at. But then another notification buzzed in, this time from the town's Facebook group. A thinly veiled post about people who thrive on drama, who refuse to accept when they're no longer welcome. The comments were already piling up. Neighbors I'd waved to, classmates I'd once shared cafeteria tables with. Every like, every snide comment felt like a new stone on my chest. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. They weren't content just pushing me out of the house. They wanted me erased from the whole damn town. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, breathing hard. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the distant bark of a dog, the normalcy of a world that kept spinning, indifferent to whether I belonged in it or not. I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over the delete app button. But then I remembered the look in Miguel's eyes, the small, quiet acknowledgement, the way he hadn't looked away. Maybe not everyone had turned against me. The thought was a fragile ember, but I cupped it carefully. I grip my phone so tightly it creaks, then sets it down, breathing slowly. Have you ever felt like I do now? Being kicked out of the house by your family, being talked about badly by everyone around you, your reputation being tarnished, even though it's not true. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now let's get to the next development of this story. They thought silence would swallow me. They forgot I knew how to fight quietly. The morning after the diner, I sat cross-legged on the living room rug. Old files and notebooks fanned out around me like fallen leaves. The light outside was thin, the kind of dull gray that made everything feel suspended. I sipped at a lukewarm cup of coffee, my mind churning harder than the old radiator pipes groaning in the corner. Miguel once stayed an extra hour after the library closed, too shy to ask for help. I helped anyway. He was just a scrawny kid back then, hiding bruises behind library books, thinking no one noticed. But I noticed. I stayed late that night, quietly shelving with him until he found the courage to ask for help with his homework. And maybe more than that, too. Maybe kindness doesn't disappear into the void after all. Maybe it waits, tucked away like a note in a forgotten jacket pocket, ready to be found again when you need it most. I wasn't going to let them erase me. Not this time. That afternoon, I found myself standing outside Elliot Rain's office, tucked between an insurance agency and a boutique that still had fall sale signs in the window, even though December was almost here. Elliot was my cousin, barely, but he was also one of the few people who hadn't crossed the street to avoid me lately. He looked up when I pushed through the door, his face splitting into a cautious smile. "Callie," he said, standing up from behind a cluttered desk. "Wasn't expecting you." "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He gestured for me to sit, pushing aside a pile of paperwork. "Shoot." I took a breath. "Mom's estate, her will. Am I still listed?" His smile faltered. He rubbed the back of his neck, the way he used to when we were kids, and he'd broken something he wasn't supposed to touch. "Callie, I probably shouldn't." "Please," I cut in, surprising us both with how sharp my voice came out. After a long pause, he sighed and leaned in, dropping his voice. "Far as I know, you're not. Changes were made last spring, quietly." I nodded, though it felt like the air had been punched from my lungs. "Thanks," I said, pushing up from the chair. My fingers left sweaty prints on the armrests. Elliot stood too, fidgeting. Look, for what it's worth, not everyone buys what they're selling. I smiled, thin and tired. I'm not here to convince anyone anymore. I stepped outside into the brittle afternoon air. Christmas lights blinked lazily from shop windows. Somewhere down the street, the Salvation Army bell clanged for donations. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and wandered without really seeing where my feet were taking me. Eventually, I ended up at a coffee shop I hadn't visited in years. A tiny place with mismatched mugs and a chalkboard menu boasting locally roasted, seriously strong. I slid into a corner booth with my laptop and a notebook, the smell of cinnamon and burnt espresso curling around me like a blanket. I opened the notebook to a fresh page, stared at the blank lines for a long moment. Taking back the truth. I wrote the words at the top of the page, pressing the pen down hard enough to etch into the next sheet. I thought about Miguel, about the way he'd looked at me yesterday, like he still saw me, not the caricature they were painting. On impulse, I found him on social media. His profile picture was recent, shorter hair now, a blazer a size too big, standing in front of a nonprofit's banner. Heart-pounding, I sent a message. Hey, it's Callie Monroe. You might not remember me, but I think I could use your help. I barely had time to sip my coffee before my phone buzzed. You don't know how much I've been waiting for this. It felt like a hand reaching through the fog. We agreed to meet after his shift at Legal Aid that evening. No fancy plans, just a quiet conversation in a place where no one would interrupt or judge. The old community center where we used to host book fairs still smelled like gym socks and floor polish. Miguel sat at one of the folding tables, a manila folder in front of him. He looked up when I entered, and for the first time in days, I saw something familiar, something kind, in someone else's eyes. We didn't hug. We didn't even shake hands. We just sat. The silence easy in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. I heard some of it, Miguel said after a beat. Not all, but enough. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. I'm not trying to burn everything down, I said. I need the truth to have a place to stand. He opened the folder, flipping through printouts, emails, bits of public records he'd dug up in a matter of hours. It's worse than you think, he said quietly, but it's also winnable. I stared at the pages, the blurry photocopies, the bits of betrayal rendered in black and white. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to cry. But most of me just felt ready. First clandestine meeting. Miguel provides contacts and initial strategy to gather more legal evidence. The truth doesn't shout. It whispers until you can't ignore it anymore. It seeped into corners and cracks, into the brittle smiles and averted eyes that had once looked right through me. And now it was slipping under doors, slipping into conversations, threading itself into the fabric of this town like a slow, inevitable tide. Mom used to say, "What the neighbors think matters more than what you feel." Maybe she should have worried about what the truth thinks. Miguel and I worked in quiet urgency, piecing together a story from fragments they had never intended for me to see. Financial records, misfiled documents, whispers of investments too risky for someone like Jeanette Monroe to have ever considered on her own. The more we dug, the clearer it became. Brielle had her fingerprints all over the decisions that had left Mom's accounts hemorrhaging. It was late November now, and the Thanksgiving wreaths on Main Street were drooping under the constant misty drizzle that never quite turned to real rain. Flyers peeled themselves from lampposts. Holiday lights blinked tiredly across the town square. Asheville was slipping into winter, and with it, the glossy veneer my family had hidden behind was starting to crack. The first shift came at Rosie's Diner. I was sitting alone in the back booth, nursing a coffee that tastes like regret when I heard them whispering. Not about me this time. About Jeanette. About Brielle. Heard she took out a second mortgage, one man muttered over his eggs. Trying to save that fancy house. All that money and nothing to show for it, the woman across from him clucked. Pride's a funny thing. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stirred my coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the sides like a clock ticking down. The next day, the foreclosure notice went up. I saw it myself, stapled right onto the whitewashed porch railing like a scarlet letter. I stood across the street, hands buried deep in my jacket pockets, watching as Mom's hands trembled, pulling it down, as Brielle's face twisted in fury and panic. They didn't see me, or maybe they didn't want to. I didn't move, didn't offer help. I just watched. That afternoon, Miguel and I met again at the community center. He spread out the latest findings on the battered wooden table, papers weighted down with chipped ceramic mugs. "You were right," he said, tapping a spreadsheet with a blunt finger. "They funneled money through fake charitable events. Mostly Brielle's doing. Your mom signed off, but she might not have understood the full scope." I nodded, staring at the numbers without really seeing them. Part of me had hoped, even after everything, that it would be cleaner than this. That Mom had been misled, manipulated, that she hadn't chosen to believe the worst about me all on her own. But the paper didn't lie. Neither did the empty bank accounts. Miguel leaned back, his chair creaking. "You want to move forward?" I hesitated, my hand hovering over the thick manila folder containing every ugly detail we'd uncovered. I remembered the night Brielle had leaned across the dinner table, venom dripping from her smile. I remembered Mom's silence, the way she hadn't defended me, hadn't even blinked. I picked up the folder. "Yes," I said. "It's time." Miguel smiled, brief and grim. "Good. I've got a contact at the Mountain Echo." The Mountain Echo was the local newspaper, small circulation, mostly human interest stories and town events. But still loud enough if you knew how to whisper the right words into the right ears. We drafted an anonymous tip, careful and clinical. Just enough breadcrumbs to pique curiosity. Just enough to start the slow, inevitable unraveling. That evening, I took the long way home, walking through downtown where shop windows still clung to their Thanksgiving decorations. A wooden turkey wobbled in the breeze outside a gift store. A tired Salvation Army volunteer rang his bell half-heartedly, bundled in 3 scarves. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt charged, like the town itself was holding its breath. I stopped at the florist's shop beneath my apartment, bought a single white daisy, and tucked it into the pocket of my jacket. Small rebellions, quiet victories. As I climbed the stairs, the first tiny flakes of snow started to fall, melting the second they touched the sidewalk. I stood by the window of my apartment, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, and watched them dance. As I walk away from their crumbling world, the first winter flurries kiss my jacket sleeve. Funny how quickly "get out" turns into "please let us in." The knock came early, too early for a Sunday morning. I pulled the quilt tighter around my shoulders, the thin winter light barely filtering through the blinds. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I wasn't in the mood for neighbors or charity drives or whatever else Asheville decided I should care about today. But the knock came again, softer this time, hesitant. I swung my legs off the couch, wincing as my bare feet hit the cold floor. Padding to the door, I glanced through the peephole and froze. Jeanette. And behind her, slightly hunched, Brielle. It took me a full breath before I undid the chain and cracked the door open. Neither of them looked like the women who had sat smug and polished across from me at Thanksgiving. Jeanette's coat was too thin for the weather, her hair limp and unstyled. Brielle's face was bare, no makeup to armor her expression. I didn't speak, just wait. Jeanette cleared her throat. "Callie," she said, her voice raw. May we come in?" For a heartbeat, I thought about closing the door, about protecting this tiny, hard-won piece I had carved out for myself. But the part of me that remembered being 8 years old in the rain, the part that still hurt, stepped aside. I opened the door wider. They shuffled inside like ghosts, bringing with them the scent of cold air and desperation. Jeanette perched on the edge of the armchair, wringing her hands. Brielle hovered near the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I didn't offer coffee, didn't offer anything. Jeanette was the first to crack. Her fingers twisted the strap of her purse until the leather squeaked. We need your help," she said, voice breaking. "The banks? The house?" She trailed off, unable to finish. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Funny," I said, not bothering to soften the edge in my voice. "Last week, you wanted me to disappear." Brielle flinched, but said nothing. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floorboards. Jeanette's eyes filled with tears, real ones this time, not the crocodile kind she summoned for church potlucks and PTA meetings. "I failed you," she whispered. "I let fear, and pride, and everything else blind me. I believed things I shouldn't have. I chose what was easy." Her voice cracked again, and she didn't bother to hide it. I didn't rush to comfort her. I let her sit with it, the way I had sat with my hurt for years. Finally, Brielle spoke, her words brittle. "It wasn't supposed to get this bad." I raised an eyebrow. "And what, exactly, was supposed to happen?" She looked up then, and for the first time, I saw something raw and broken in her eyes. "They promised. They said if we just made some adjustments, we'd get it all back, the money, the reputation, everything." "Who's they?" I asked, my voice low. Brielle hesitated. Then, almost inaudibly, "Investors. Some fundraisers for the hospital. It was supposed to help everyone." I shook my head slowly. "You tied Mom's life, and yours, to con artists, and now you're surprised the ground gave out." Brielle's mouth trembled, but she said nothing. Maybe for the first time in her life, she realized there was no spin that could save her. Jeanette reached toward me instinctively, but I stepped back. I needed space. I needed clarity. "I didn't force you to shut me out," I said, my voice steady. "I didn't force you to rewrite the story so you could be the hero and I could be the villain." Jeanette nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked. I took a deep breath, feeling the final shift inside me, the last piece of old hurt lifting off my chest. "If you want my help," I said carefully, "it's under my terms." Both women froze, like deer sensing the snap of a twig underfoot. "No more lies," I continued. "No more rewriting history. No more pretending I'm the villain in your story." Jeanette nodded quickly, desperate. Brielle hesitated longer, but finally, grudgingly, bobbed her head. "And if you ever try to smear me again," I said, my voice dropping into something steel-edged, "you'll find out exactly how much worse it can get." The threat hung between us, heavy and undeniable. They didn't argue, they didn't beg. They knew. I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Then, finally, I nodded toward the door. "I'll be in touch." They filed out quietly, Jeanette casting one last pleading glance over her shoulder. Brielle didn't look back. As the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I lean against the door, breathing steadily, feeling the weight of the past lift as the first flakes of winter cling to my window pane. Healing doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like painting over old walls and learning to breathe again. The next few days passed in a quiet hum. I didn't rush to fix things. I didn't rush to rescue Jeanette or Brielle either. Let them sit with their consequences a little longer. Sometimes kindness means letting people feel the weight of what they built. Miguel and I stayed in touch, trading messages and meeting now and then for coffee at Rosie's diner. He never pushed, never pried, just sat across from me, sharing the kind of silence that said, "I see you," without demanding anything in return. One chilly afternoon, he slid a folder across the table toward me. "Some folks from the community center are looking for mentors," he said casually, sipping his coffee. "They need someone to help with the new literacy program. You're basically overqualified." I smiled, a real one this time. "You trying to get me to do your job?" He laughed, the sound warm and easy. "Nah. I just figured, you've got a lot of good left to give. Might as well give it somewhere that wants it." I tucked the folder into my bag without opening it. Maybe later, maybe soon. Outside, Christmas decorations were going up, a little more crooked and tired-looking this year. The town was trying, in its own stubborn, resilient way. So was I. At home that evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. I thought about forgiveness, about how it wasn't a switch you flipped, but a garden you tended slowly, stubbornly, even when nothing seemed to bloom. Jeanette called once, left a voicemail thick with apologies and promises. I didn't rush to call back. I didn't slam the door either. Some bridges needed rebuilding, one cautious board at a time. Brielle didn't call. I wasn't sure she ever would. And maybe that was okay too. One morning, the florist downstairs caught me on my way out. "You're Callie Monroe, right?" she said, handing me a small bouquet, white daisies and pale blue forget-me-nots wrapped in brown paper. "No card," she said with a shrug. "But it's paid for." I stood there a moment, staring at the flowers. I didn't need a card to know. Miguel. Quiet gratitude blooming in an unexpected place. I carried the flowers upstairs like something sacred, setting them in a chipped glass vase by the window. They caught the morning light, fragile and fierce all at once. Later that day, I found the paint swatches I'd stuffed into a drawer weeks ago. Seafoam green. A color like hope, like open skies after a storm. I pulled on an old t-shirt, cracked open the paint can, and dipped my brush into the future. The first stroke across the wall was shaky. The second was stronger. By the third, I was smiling. I didn't need to tear everything down. I could build something new right here. Maybe family wasn't about bloodlines or perfect holidays. Maybe it was about the people who stayed, who showed up, who offered you flowers without asking anything in return. I finished the first coat just as the sun slipped behind the hills, the room glowing soft and green. I stood in the middle of it all, paint smudged and barefoot, and let myself believe it. Believe that I wasn't broken beyond repair, that scars didn't mean you couldn't grow something beautiful again. I watched the fresh paint dry under the golden evening light, a quiet, unshakable peace blooming where the old wounds used to be. There are seasons in life when it feels easier to close the door and walk away, but sometimes the real courage is in quietly choosing to rebuild. In the cracks where judgment once lived, kindness found a place to bloom, reminding me that healing doesn't come from grand gestures. It grows from steady, unseen roots. When we look beyond what's broken and offer grace instead of condemnation, we give ourselves, and others, the chance to begin again. And maybe, just maybe, a single open hand can turn a lifetime of closed doors into a home.